two different serial killers. Both preyed on the same type of victim during one of the most tragic drug crises in the United States. Both men operated for at least 20 years without being caught, and even today, their total number of victims remains unknown. But while one killer's crimes made national news, the others barely made the police's radar. This is the history behind the crime. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of The History Behind the Crime. I'm Erin Lasley. I'm not joined today by little Miss Maggie, who was yippity and a yappity all day, so she had to go into the bedroom while I was recording. Also, I think she was tired of me talking about something that's coming up, and I want to give you guys a heads up on it. Because I'm going to be talking about it until like the end of April, like when it actually happens. I booked myself a cruise. Not just any cruise. Oh no. Crime cruise. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, I will be cruising around the Gulf of Mexico with CeCe Moore, Paul Holes, Dr. Henry Lee, and a whole bunch of other people. And if you're a true crime nut, you're probably drooling right now and Googling crime cruise. So honestly, it's a real thing, and it was a lot more affordable than CrimeCon, which is also a real thing. And I'm not advertising for them. I'm just super excited about it. And I'm not going to stop talking about this for a while, so strap in. Or just skip a few minutes ahead. I'm not going to know. I've already been planning my cruise wardrobe. My sister's been giving me all sorts of cruise tips while my mom is still deciding whether she wants to go or not. And to be honest, somebody should really go with me to make sure I behave myself. I'll keep you guys up to date on what's going on with that. I'll even try to do an episode on board. But for now, you know what? Let's just get into this episode's history. And yes, we're going to be talking about history in this episode. Back in July, I was driving back to Washington from my sister's place in Colorado. There's this very specific stretch of interstate just north of Ogden, Utah. I love to drive in the morning. There's like no traffic other than the occasional semi. It's peaceful. It's beautiful. And for some odd reason, it always puts me in the mood to listen to My Favorite Murder, which I know I've mentioned a few times in other episodes. MFM is a comedy true crime podcast created and hosted by the murder queens, I Bow Down, Georgia Hardstark, and Karen Kilgareth. Hilarious podcast, but not only will it make you laugh, it'll make you cry, and it makes my mom say things like, I wish those girls wouldn't cuss so much. On this drive through northern Utah, I was listening to my queens talking about Lonnie Franklin Jr., the Grimm sleeper, and the Los Angeles Police Department's investigation of the murders, and that got my mind churning. So much so that I pulled over to the side of the interstate to write myself some reminders. And anyone who really knows me would be amazed because I'm the driver who needs to pee like crazy, but I keep saying, I'll stop at the next exit because I hate stopping when I'm driving. I just want to get there. But I stopped and I wrote some notes because I knew this would be a good one. Well, listening to their episode on Franken, I kept comparing him and the investigation to Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, and the GRK Task Force. Why? There's a lot of comparisons and contrasts that we're going to go over in the next two episodes. Yeah, two. Some of those being the decade they operated in, the locations, the victims, the investigations, the public outcry, and some of the things that contributed to the victimology and the investigations. I did a lot of research on this one and even spent some time in my favorite breweries, which there are tons up here in Tacoma. So yeah, I was drinking a few beers and reading Christine Pelisek's book, The Grimm Sleeper, The Lost Women of South Central, and rereading Ann Rule's book, Green River Running Red. Two of the best books you will ever read in the true crime genre. These books need to be on your shelf. A lot of my research also came from the regular places, documentaries, which there are a lot of, articles, and even some professional studies I found after I actually subscribed to an online journal database. I sometimes miss being a student and getting that stuff for free. There's just so much information that this needed to be a two-parter to do it justice. So welcome to part one of The Grimm Sleeper versus the Green River Killer. Normally, if I had written this as a study, I would have started off with a nice introduction and slowly built it up. However, this is a freaking podcast and I can do whatever the hell I want to do. So let's start. I know a lot of you, especially those of you who live in the Pacific Northwest, know who Gary Ridgway is. Also known as the Green River Killer, Ridgway is one of the most prolific serial killers in U.S. history. In 2003, Ridgway was convicted of 49 counts of murder, but he confessed and is suspected of a lot more. He started killing sex workers in the Seattle area in the 1980s and may have been active all the way up to 2001. Talking to a coworker who was a teenager at the time of the crimes and lived in the area, she confessed to me that she and a friend hitchhiked one day in I think she said the late 1980s, and suspected that the driver that picked them up was Ridgway. Obviously, I thoroughly berated her for hitchhiking, like she hadn't already learned her lesson as a teenager, and spent some time reassuring her that, Ridgway had stopped killing by then, and it probably wasn't him. Then I started to dig into this, and it appears that Ridgway may have still been killing in the late 80s. So Cindy and Cindy's friend who tunes in, what the hell were you two thinking? And thank God you are still alive. That makes two coworkers now. Two. I've known who bummed rides from two different notorious serial killers. What the hell, people? Don't hitchhike. Anyhow, we're going to talk a lot more about Ridgway later. A lot of you have probably never heard of Lonnie Franklin Jr., also known as the Grimm Sleeper for his apparent lack of activity from the late 1980s until the 2000s. Franklin was convicted of 10 murders in 2016, but may have been responsible for the deaths of 100 women, predominantly sex workers, in South Central LA. Here's the thing about Franklin. He was black. Yeah, you don't hear a lot about black serial killers, but here we are. And yeah, we're going to talk a lot about race in these two episodes. If talking about race makes you uncomfortable, too bad. I guess you can stop listening, and that's your right. But race played an important part in justice being denied for 2 decades. Let's face these prejudices. Let's explore them, and let's learn from them. We're also going to be talking a lot about good cops and bad cops. We're going to be talking about sex workers and drugs. We're going to be talking about who deserves justice and who doesn't. Spoiler alert, every victim deserves justice. Whoa, Erin. Big soapbox you got there. Yeah, that's going to be staying out this entire time too. So get ready. Where to start? I thought we would start with victimology. Both Franklin and Ridgway's victims were predominantly sex workers. You're going to hear me use the term sex worker instead of prostitute. Why? By using the term sex worker, I'm recognizing that sex work is work, whereas the word prostitution has connotations of morality and criminality. Using words such as prostitute, whore, streetwalker, or variations thereof stigmatizes a sex worker and demeans them. Those words make sex workers seem like they are undeserving of empathy, kindness, and justice. When I use the phrase sex worker, I'm talking about someone who chooses to sell sex services in exchange for money, goods, or yes, even drugs. I am not referring to people who are being sexually trafficked. They are not sex workers. They are victims. Sex workers are what we call high risk victims, meaning they're pretty much always in the wrong place at the wrong time. Most of you who are listening are more than likely low risk victims. You live in semi decent or safe neighborhoods. You don't frequently hit the bars or clubs alone. You're not drug users, and I'm not talking about a little Mary J. And you don't normally associate with violent offenders. Bonus points if you're a dude. Sex workers typically work in areas infested by crime. They're expected to perform their work alone with their client, are a part of a population consisting of higher than average drug users, and their clients could very well be violent offenders. There's also certain stereotypes that surround sex workers. Serial killers interviewed by law enforcement and psychologists have talked about how they've seen sex workers as expendable and no one's going to miss them. Serial offenders target sex workers because they believe they are, quote, cleaning up the streets, or that sex workers need to die because they're sinning. Serial offenders have talked about the fantasy of, hey, if I can have sex with them, then I can do whatever I want with them. But these killers have also hit on two true facts. Sex workers are easy to pick up without anyone noticing or caring, and some law enforcement just don't care about sex workers. Harsh? Yes. True? Also yes. Author Robert Kolker demonstrated this hard reality in his book, Lost Girls, An Unsolved American Mystery. In 2010, Long Island law enforcement were looking for a woman named Shannon Gilbert, who was a sex worker in the Gilgo Beach area. They didn't find Gilbert then, but instead found the remains of 4 people. In 2011, while they were searching for Gilbert, they found the remains of 6 more people. Investigators determined it was likely the same offender killed all 10 people, and most of the victims, not all of them, were sex workers. Gilbert's body was later found in 2011. The coroner reported the cause of death was drowning by misadventure, but an outside report says she died by strangulation. In his book, Kolker pretty much says if it wasn't for the search for Gilbert, none of these victims may have ever been found because no one was really looking for them, and society just doesn't care about sex workers or the impoverished. There's some other hinky stuff that went on in the Gilgo Beach investigation, including a really messed up Suffolk County police chief who was known to abuse sex workers, use narcotics, keep pornography and bondage items in his police car, deprive people of their civil rights, and on and on and on. Don't worry, he got busted pretty good by the feds. There are so many documentaries about the Long Island serial killer out there that you can watch. Who killed all these people? The case remains unsolved. Both the Suffolk County Police Department and the FBI are still working the case. I normally save this for the end, but since we're here, if you know anything about the deaths of Shannon Gilbert, 24-year-old Melissa Barthelemy, 22-year-old Megan Waterman, 27-year-old Amber Lynn Costello, 25-year-old Maureen Brainard Barnes, 24-year-old Valerie Mack, an unidentified Asian person who may be male between the ages of 17 and 23, 2 unidentified females, and an unidentified toddler in the Gilgo Beach case, please call the Suffolk County Police Department at 1-800-220-TIPS. If you feel uncomfortable going to the police, you can contact me with your tip at thehistorybehindthecrime@gmail.com or Instagram at thehistorybehindthecrime. I will ensure the proper authorities receive it. Someone out there knows something. You may not, but you may know people in Long Island area that do. Share the story with them. Going back to victimology. Sex workers are pretty easy prey for serial offenders. So much so that between 1970 and 2009, 32% of serial killer victims were sex workers. Within the last decade, 43% of serial killer victims were sex workers. Obviously, this isn't a new trend. Some of the victims of the most infamous serial killer of all time, Jack the Ripper, were sex workers. Other killers that hunted sex workers were Robert Hansen, the butcher baker of Anchorage, Joel Rifkin, Robert Picton, Steve Wright, Richard Cottingham, the torso killer, and Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, just to name a few. Obviously, we can include Gary Ridgway and Lonnie Franklin Jr. in there too. Something else that should be on your radar, and this actually leads into our next topic of epidemics. Currently, the United States Midwest is seeing an increase of serial murders among sex workers. In Chicago alone, someone is killing sex workers. Between 2001 and today, at least 50 women, predominantly black and sex workers, have been killed in a similar fashion and left in alleys, abandoned in buildings, garbage heaps, or in snowdrifts. 13 men have been arrested for some of these murders, but due to public pressure, police are reviewing their crimes. There are also a high number of sex worker deaths in other Midwest cities, but many of these have been attributed to overdoses, though there are several journalists and armchair detectives who believe they are murders. Why so many deaths among sex workers in the Midwest? Because the Midwest is almost ground zero for the opioid epidemic, and a high number of sex workers work to get high. The more sex workers there are, the more likely a serial killer or killers will be hunting. This is what happened in the 1980s with Ridgway and Franklin, only it wasn't the opioid epidemic. It was the crack epidemic. I think we all know what crack is, and for those of you who don't, it's pretty much just cocaine and baking soda mixed together and baked. Of course, I'm not going to give you the recipe here. This makes the drug easier to smoke, which makes a crackling noise in pipes, hence the name crack. Crack became big in the US during the 1980s, especially because of its affordability. How cheap was crack? In some major cities, you could get a hit for $2.50, which is about $7 today. You could get a vial anywhere between $5 and $20. And in the rough economic times, the 1980s, that was a pretty good deal. It didn't cost a whole paycheck and it'd make you forget you had a lousy job. Between 1982 and 1985, the amount of cocaine users went up by 1.6 million people. Many of those people weren't snorting the white powder. They were smoking it. The crack epidemic impacted black communities the most since racial segregation and discriminatory banking and housing practices forced many black families into urban inner cities where crack use was at the highest. 80% of crack users in the 1980s were black. Out of this group, crack was the most popular among women and youth. Among women, it was cheap because women don't make as much money as their male counterparts, and smoking crack was deemed more acceptable than intravenous drugs such as heroin. And I really appreciated how Adriana Fenimore described crack use among black women in her research article, Geeking and Freaking. Quote, inner city, crack-addicted black women were seen by the American public as the antithesis of the traditional conservative family values that emerged politically in the 1980s. Black women addicted to crack in the 1980s were the objects of public contempt, largely due to negative media portrayals and the political agenda of the religious New Right. As a result, they faced harsh criticism and systemic mistreatment, which is probably why there's such an issue with the police investigations into murdered women in South Central LA during the 1980s. We're going to get into that later. Needless to say, crack was booming in large cities, not only in LA, but in Seattle as well. Sure, compared to LA, Seattle might seem like a sleepy Pacific Northwest town with not a lot going on except for, fishing and a small but growing grunge scene. But Seattle saw its fair share of drug abuse, and in some cases, drug violence. Yes, the drug violence in South Central in the 1980s was escalating quickly. A lot of it was due to the economic downturn of the 1980s, and many factory and other blue collar jobs left South Central, leaving a vacuum for crack dealing. Many young people saw crack dealing as a way to make a living, and many of these young people got into trouble trying to maintain their territory. Yep, this is where gang activity in South Central would really take off. Not that there wasn't gang activity before, but the crack business was what really propelled the increase in gangs. Now we have crack running rampant in both LA and Seattle, and the economics that had really gone to shit. It's no wonder more women in the 1980s turned to sex work as a way to make a living and support their addiction. What's even more unfortunate is assholes like Franklin and Ridgway use this as an opportunity to play out their sick fantasies. Now, don't think Franklin and Ridgway were the only sick scumbags preying on women in these cities during the 1980s. In South Central alone, researchers believe there were at least 6 killers hunting among sex workers. In Seattle and other Pacific Northwest towns, police are more than certain Ridgway was not the only one. Also, you should know that both sex workers and serial killers are migratory. Sex workers will go where the customers are. Some stay in the same state, but just switch up cities, while others move states entirely. LA sex workers may head over to Vegas or even north to San Francisco or Seattle, while Seattle sex workers hop over to Olympia, down to Portland, or even all the way down to LA. With such migratory lifestyles, when one goes missing, it can be difficult to determine whether they moved cities or something more nefarious happened to them. Serial killers are also the same. They go where the prey is. Not so much the case of Franklin, at least investigators really don't know. But investigators have theorized Ridgway operated not only in the Seattle area, but south into Northern California and north into Canada. When offenders do this, it can make it difficult to link victims to one specific killer without DNA evidence. Take Ted Bundy, for example. He was only convicted for the murders in the state of Florida, but he's suspected of over 36 murders in 7 states. Israel Keyes was suspected of over 11 murders from Alaska all the way to New York. I won't even go into all of the interstate killers because we just don't have the time in this episode, but the numbers would terrify you and would convince you not to travel on the interstate or live next to one. What I'm trying to say is the migratory nature of both sex workers and serial killers makes it hard for investigators to identify victims, link victims to an offender, and catch an offender who could have already left town. While Franklin's victims were pretty much native Angelenos who were raised and lived in South Central, at least the ones we know about, Ridgway's victims came from all over, either as runaways or sex workers looking for work. Finally, let's look at both South Central and Seattle. While both areas certainly suffered from the crack epidemic and sex work was a popular vice, there were some major differences. The racial makeup of each area is important to this episode. South Central LA was predominantly black in the 1980s because early restrictive housing covenants and redlining pushed most of the LA's black residents into South Central, which was really just Central Avenue corridor. After 1948, South Central grew from roughly 2.5 square miles to several hundred blocks of businesses and residences. Pretty much the same happened in Seattle. During World War II, the black population in Seattle grew because of the many military contracting jobs to make ships and planes. Because of redlining, many black residents wound up in the Central District, which was 80% black in the 1980s, but is now 10% black today because of gentrification. Overall in Seattle, black residents made up 10% of the population. However, we're not necessarily talking about the Central District here. Ridgway predominantly hunted in what was known as the SeaTac Strip, which was, and I guess still is, just right outside of the SeaTac airport. Its population was pretty diverse in the 1980s: white, black, Hispanic, Asian, and indigenous. It was also a hotbed for sex work because of all the bars and the pay by the hour hotels. It was also going through some major renovations, leaving a lot of buildings empty and available for some pretty dodgy things. Another huge difference was crime. South Central LA, as I mentioned earlier, became plagued with drug and gang violence. And, to be fair, police were understaffed and overworked with all the murders and other violent crimes. In the Seattle area, the biggest crime news was serial killers, from Bundy to Kenneth Bianchi, one of the Hillside Stranglers, in the late 1970s, to the mysterious person killing and dumping sex workers throughout the 1980s, which we would later learn was Ridgway. Seattle and King County law enforcement weren't as overworked as LA, and Seattle cops had a lot better reputation than cops down in LA. In Seattle, most people liked cops. In South Central, most people distrusted cops. Because of the historical police relations with South Central, it's not that difficult to understand why. The famous LA police chief, William Parker, who was in office between 1950 and 1966, promoted racial profiling, aggressive policing, and police harassment of South Central businesses and residents. He also closed down bars and clubs that hosted both white and black patrons because he didn't believe in, and I can't believe I'm going to say this, racial mixing. The guy made the relationship so bad between law enforcement and black residents that both groups are still trying to recover to this day. His policing policies led to the LA Watts riot in 1965, and I guess laid the foundation for the 1992 LA riots. I'm not saying Seattle didn't or doesn't have its problems with police and race relations. It just wasn't as bad as it was in South Central during the 1980s. I mean, hello, NWA, straight out of Compton, fuck the police. This is that. Erin, where are you going with all this? That's a great question. I would love to tell you, as one of my favorite TikTokers, Elise Myers, would say. Lonnie Franklin Jr. and Gary Ridgway both killed in the 1980s. They both took advantage of the crack epidemic. They both preyed on sex workers, and neither was caught until the 2000s after DNA nailed the sons of bitches. They also killed in cities where investigators had plenty of experience with serial investigations, and the public was used to watching the nightly news and not being surprised some shitbird was preying on innocent people in their neighborhoods. But what was different? Simply put, the Green River Task Force was made up of over several hundred people from all over Seattle, King County, and other local agencies, and the FBI, including John Douglas, Woot Woot Minehunter, and was all over the press. While in LA, the overworked LAPD kind of knew that there were some murders going on, but generally called the victims subhuman. And the local community never really had any idea there was a serial killer in their neighborhood, let alone probably 6 different serial killers. Yeah, so there's that. I honestly think that this was the most comprehensive, if probably not a little bit convoluted, historical analysis I've ever done for y'all. Seriously, my notebook for this episode is a mess. And we haven't even gotten to the crimes yet. But wait, isn't there more? Yeah, there's more. But I was just setting this up for the next episode, where we will finally get into the sick and twisted minds of those SOBs and the investigations. Oh, I wanted to end this episode with, I just want to say that there's a lot going on in our country right now, and there's a lot of finger pointing going on. Barely does a day go by when I don't get dragged into or start a political conversation that ends with hurt feelings, and I've started to avoid certain people because I just don't want to talk politics with them, and I am certain at least one person is avoiding me because of the same thing. Instead of focusing on who's right and who's wrong, our country is going to hell, the stupid liberals or conservatives are taking over everything with their woke or racist whatever. How about for the next week, we just concentrate on extending a hand of friendship, volunteering, or donating to your favorite nonprofit organization? This week I donated to a local women's shelter, and I urge you to do something like that too. Shelters are always in need of hygiene items, especially female hygiene items: socks, underwear, and gently used blankets. VA nursing homes can also use hygiene items: t-shirts with the chest pockets and circulation socks. Trust me, donating or volunteering will do a lot more for you and your community than losing friends over politics. So if you have the means, if you have the time, do something good this week. And that's all I have for this episode. Next episode, we'll finally get into the Green River and the Grimm Sleeper investigations. Until then, make love, not war, and take care of yourselves and each other. Bye.